Tired of using the same boring chord progressions? Well, you're in luck. I'm going to show you how to make your harmony more interesting. Grab your backpack, join me at the Prog School. I've noticed a lot of modern prog is full of cool rhythmic ideas, unique melodies, and incredible playing, but often feels very generic harmonically, rarely straying from diatonic chord progressions and triadic harmony. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at a couple simple devices that can make your harmonies more interesting. Reaching outside of basic harmonic sounds can add a lot of new colors and emotions to your music. For this lesson, I've written a fairly straightforward progressive metal tune. I actually started by writing this tune entirely in the D natural minor scale, or the Aeolian mode. And then I went back and used a couple of these harmonic devices I'm going to show you to spice up the tune. Nothing crazy, just enough to make it a little more harmonically interesting. The first harmonic device we're going to look at is to add extensions to basic triadic harmony. Here are the triads, or 3-note chords, that come from D natural minor. These can be made a little more interesting by adding a 7th to each chord. You do this by stacking another interval of a third on top. For example, the chord D minor, D, F, A, gets a C added on top of it to make it a D minor 7. Here are all the 7th chords from D natural minor. If I keep stacking thirds on top, eventually I'll get a chord that has every note from the D natural minor scale. Here's D minor with thirds stacked on top, making a D minor 11 flat 13. Anytime you add a note to a basic triad, you get what is called an extended chord. Extended chords are a great way to make your harmony more interesting. Here are all the fully extended chords from D natural minor. Notice that none of these chords have a note that leaves the scale, but they're starting to sound much fuller and richer than the basic triads. Each one of these chords contain every single note from the D natural minor scale. And that's something to keep in mind when you're working on new harmonic ideas, that any note from within the key is available to you. Let's take a look at a couple of extended chords from my tune that stay within the key of D natural minor. Right at the beginning of the tune, the electric piano plays this arpeggiated figure. This melody becomes the main melodic theme for the tune and outlines these extended chords. I'll talk about the second half of this intro section later on, since it goes outside the key of D natural minor. But the chord extensions in these first few measures add some really nice color. Another thing I like to do is add chord extensions into riffs. In measure 3 and 4 of the main heavy guitar riff, we get these chords. Some of them are arpeggiated, and some of them are played as block chords. It's nice to get away from power chords and heavier riffs sometimes. The dissonance of these extended chords sounds really intense with heavy distortion. Probably the best example of extended chords that stay within the key in this tune happens in the bridge/guitar solo. Here are some of those chords in the keyboard pad. At its core, this is a pretty basic progression. B flat major, G minor, B flat major, A minor. By adding in some of these extensions, this progression really comes to life. Also notice how these voicings are pretty closed, meaning the notes are close together. This adds tension and works really well with keyboard instruments. Closed, more dissonant voicings don't always work well with certain instruments, like distorted guitars, so be really careful when you're using them. Here are the chords in the clean guitar for those same 6 bars. Notice the chord voicings have a few different extensions. For example, on the B flat chord we have the sharp 11 or the note E. As I mentioned earlier, you can use pretty much any note from the scale with any chord if you voice it correctly. Also, not every single extension needs to be in every instrument. In this case, the guitar is the only instrument that plays the sharp 11 on this B flat chord. One way I'm able to get these extended chords really easily is by using open strings in the guitar. The end of the solo is a perfect example of this. The first chord here is a G minor 13, and I'm using the open E string, and that note E becomes a 13th of the chord. Between the pad and the guitar voicings on this particular chord, it has every single note from the D natural minor scale except for C, making for a really nice rich sound. I also use the open E string on the next two chords, and that gives me a B flat major 9 sharp 11, with the sharp 11 being that open E string again, and a C add 9. I'd recommend spending some time experimenting with extended chords within a given key. Here are just a few chords I threw together really quickly on the piano. I spent about a minute making these, and they're all pretty cool sounding. There's pretty much endless chords available without ever leaving the key. Sprinkling in a few of these in your music can give you all kinds of new sounds to work with. The second harmonic device we'll look at is chord inversions. When you invert a chord, you flip the order of the notes so you have a different note as the root. D minor, which has the notes D, F, A, could be inverted so F becomes the root. Then you'd have F, A, D, same notes, but a very different sound. This is called first inversion. If I put the A in the bass, it becomes A, D, F, and that would be second inversion. This is a nice way to take basic triads and add some interest to them. You can also use inversions to make root note movement flow more naturally. In bar 4 of the main riff of this tune, the chords go from F major 9 to A minor / E. By putting the E in the bass on the A minor chord, the bass notes move down from F to E and then to D, making for a really natural step down the scale. Another great use for inversions is to keep the same root note between two different chords. Here's the progression from the final melodic section of this tune. Here it moves from G minor to E diminished with a G in the bass. This allows for the root note to stay the same while an inner voice in the chords moves. This adds some extra color over the same root note and creates a nice stepwise movement in the inner voice of these chords. Sometimes basic triads are the best option for a certain part of a tune, and using inversions can help to spice these up a bit. The last harmonic device we're going to look at is modal mixture. So far, nothing I've done has left the key of D natural minor, and we've explored some interesting sounds, but to really expand the harmonic palette I have to work with, I need to reach outside the key. Modal mixture is exactly what it sounds like. It's mixing modes together. To do this, you need to build different modes off the same root note. Here's D Aeolian and D Dorian side by side. Notice there's only one note different between the two, the B flat in Aeolian and the B in Dorian. While only the one note is different, there are 3 different chords between the two. So if I'm in Aeolian and I borrow from Dorian, I instantly have a lot of new sounds available to me. Same thing happens with D Aeolian and D Phrygian. Only one note different, but lots of different chords. Here in the second 4 bars of the climactic melodic section, I borrow a chord from D Dorian, B minor 7 flat 5, and I also borrow a chord from D Phrygian, E flat. These chords really jump out since the melody here is the same as it was in the first 4 bars, where it never left D Aeolian. These chords reharmonize this melody and give it a different emotional impact. Also notice that both of these borrowed chords resolve a half step down. This creates nice strong root movement to get back into the key. I'm planning on doing full lessons on each of the major scale modes in the future, but for now what you need to know is you can borrow notes and chords from other modes as long as they have the same root note. Here's a few other examples of modal mixture in this tune. The last bar of the main riff I borrow from the Locrian mode on this A flat major 7 sharp 11 chord. Here's the chart for Locrian. The last beat of that same measure, I borrow the E-flat chord from Phrygian again. In the last bar of the guitar solo bridge section, I borrow the note B from Dorian and get this spicy D minor 6/9 chord. The rest of this section I talked about earlier when looking at extended chords that stayed within the key, and having this resolve to a D minor chord with this added Dorian flavor adds some nice tension after all the B flat notes that came before. Those are some examples of modal mixture using the major scale modes, also called the church modes. Now let's look at one more mode I borrowed from, and this is probably the most important one in this particular tune. Modal mixture can apply to other scales outside of the major scale. I could borrow from any scale I wanted to, as long as it has the root note D in this particular case. The mode I borrowed from in this tune is a personal favorite of mine, Dorian sharp 4. This is the fourth mode of harmonic minor, in this case the fourth mode of A harmonic minor. This is a really cool exotic sounding scale. It has the tritone, in this case G sharp, in it. It also has the natural sixth. It gives you that harmonic minor sound, but in a less cliche way than Phrygian dominant, which is the most popular harmonic minor mode for prog and metal. I bring this sound in right away in the tune. We looked at the first two bars of the piano intro already, but in the fourth bar I bring in this Dorian sharp 4 flavor with a G sharp diminished 7th chord. Notice the contour of this melodic line is similar over the D minor 9 and the G sharp diminished 7th. The notes have just been altered to fit over the G sharp diminished 7th chord. This creates a more dissonant, dark, and exotic version of this same melodic hook. This back and forth from Aeolian to Dorian sharp 4 keeps happening throughout the tune, and this mirrors the overall feeling of going between these light and dark sections. I do this again in the main riff. The first half is in Aeolian, and the second half brings in the G sharp diminished 7th chord from Dorian sharp 4. The verses are the same as the piano intro, going back and forth between Aeolian and Dorian sharp 4. In the first verse, I pedal the note D in the bass and let these different sounds play over that root note. In the second verse, the first half pedals the note D, and then the root notes change in the second half to follow the chords. Notice on both verses I use an E/G sharp chord to get to the chorus, which starts on G minor. This chord is borrowed from Dorian sharp 4 and uses an inversion, as well as moving chromatically to the next chord, G minor. This is a good example of combining some of these harmonic devices together. There's one last thing to talk about in this tune, and that's this heavy breakdown riff. First thing to note is that this uses the main melodic theme, but with the notes doubled up for a heavier feel. This is maybe the most clear example of moving between Aeolian and Dorian sharp 4. Here I think the feel of these two sounds play really well off each other. This lesson is focused on harmony, but I want to talk about the rhythm of this riff because it's pretty interesting. First, the rhythmic pattern is played in its basic form with the doubled up notes bouncing between the rhythm guitars. The pattern happens over a bar of 4/4 and a bar of 11/8. And within that, there's these melodic patterns of 5/8, 5/8, 2/4, and 5/8. When the riff kicks in with the full band, this pattern happens twice. This equals 19 quarter note beats, or 4 measures of 4/4 and 1 measure of 3/4. What I did was to tack on another quarter note to get 5 measures of 4/4. This still felt a little bit odder than I wanted it to, being a 5-bar phrase, so I added 1 measure of 4/4 that's a variation on the melodic riff from the chorus. This gives the riff a total of 6 4/4 measures. The syncopation of these odd patterns over the 4/4 makes for a super groovy riff. This whole riff happens 4 times, and to keep it interesting, I do a couple of cool things with the drums as well as the overall tempo. The first time through, the snare drum follows the riff, hitting with the important accents of the riff. The second time through, the snare hits on the backbeat, beat 3, which gives a heavier and more straight ahead feel. Then the third time through, there's a tempo change. The riff goes from 150 beats per minute to 120 beats per minute. There's a lot of ways you can do tempo changes. Sometimes you can do a direct tempo change to an unrelated tempo. In this case, I'm doing something called metric modulation, where the tempo change is based off of something from the original tempo. The slower tempo of 120 beats per minute here is equal to 5/16 notes at the faster tempo of 150 beats per minute. You can see this clearly at the end of this part right before it goes back to 150 beats per minute. The snare here plays 5 notes in a beat, or quintuplets, and this is the equivalent of 16th notes at 150 beats per minute. This is pretty complicated, and I'll probably do a lesson on just metric modulation in the future, but this was a really nice way to vary up this riff since it repeats so many times. It also makes the riff feel a little bit heavier to slow it down here. The fourth and final time through this riff, we get double time in the drums, with the snare hitting on beats 2 and 4. This builds up the energy before the riff ends, and then the piano intro plays the song out. Hope you all enjoyed this lesson, and hopefully it gave you some techniques and ideas for breaking outside of a key or scale. I think being able to make the harmony more interesting can add so many new colors and emotions to the music you're writing. Try some of these techniques out for yourself and let me know if they helped you. As always, I'll let the full tune play out at the end of the video. You can follow the link in the description below to pick this up on my Bandcamp. I'll post just the song here on YouTube, and it'll be available on all your major streaming services, but Bandcamp is the best way to support me directly. If you enjoyed this lesson, like, subscribe, hit the bell notification, and give it a share. It really helps me out. And until next time, stay proggy.